The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Martha Jefferson's new home as she carefully arranged her last family photo on the living room wall. At 68 years old, her dark skin showed few wrinkles, and her gray-streaked hair was always neatly tied back in a bun. After serving 30 years as the state's attorney, she had chosen this quiet neighborhood in Baltimore for her retirement. The house wasn't big or fancy. It was a simple two-bedroom home with faded blue paint and white shutters. Martha liked it that way. She didn't want to draw attention to herself or her past career. To her new neighbors, she was just Ms. Martha, the kind elderly lady who had moved in last week. As she stepped out onto her small front porch, Martha noticed young Tommy from next door struggling with his math homework. The 10-year-old boy sat on his front steps, frustration clear on his face as he erased something for the third time. "Having trouble there, young man?" Martha called out, her voice warm and friendly. Tommy looked up, nodding sadly. "It's these fractions, Ms. Martha. They don't make any sense," he said, throwing his pencil down. Martha walked over, her comfortable shoes making soft sounds on the concrete sidewalk. "Well, why don't I help you with that? I used to help my grandson with his math all the time." She didn't mention that her grandson was now a successful accountant, thanks partly to their many study sessions. As they worked through the problems together, Mrs. Johnson from across the street walked by with her shopping bags. "Bless you, Ms. Martha. You're such a gift to this neighborhood," she said, smiling at the scene. Martha just smiled back modestly. She enjoyed these simple interactions, so different from her days in the courtroom where every word had to be carefully chosen and every action calculated. Here, she could just be herself, or at least the version of herself she chose to share. Later that afternoon, Martha worked in her small garden planting tomatoes and peppers. Her hands, once used to handling legal documents and signing important papers, now dug into the rich soil with quiet satisfaction. Several neighbors walked by, and she exchanged friendly waves and greetings with each one. The local kids started calling her house the homework help spot as more children began showing up with their schoolwork. Martha didn't mind. It kept her mind sharp and gave her a sense of purpose. She set up a small table on her porch with supplies and snacks, creating a welcoming space for young learners. What her neighbors didn't know was that in her home office, Martha still kept detailed files of her most important cases. 30 years of fighting corruption and injustice had taught her to always be prepared. Her law books lined the shelves, and her laptop contained carefully organized records of every major case she had handled. That evening, as Martha sat in her comfortable armchair reading the local newspaper, she noticed a concerning pattern in the community news section. Several elderly residents had reported issues with local law enforcement, but the stories were buried in the back pages. She took out her notebook, an old habit she couldn't break, and started making notes. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Tommy's mother, Sarah, bringing over a freshly baked apple pie. "It's to thank you for helping Tommy," she explained. "His math grade has already improved." Martha accepted the pie with genuine gratitude. This was why she had chosen this neighborhood: real people, real connections, no pretense. As she chatted with Sarah, she noticed a police car driving slowly down the street. The officers inside were watching the houses too carefully for a routine patrol. Before going to bed that night, Martha looked at the family photo she had hung earlier. It showed her with her late husband, the children, and grandchildren at her retirement ceremony. Only they knew the full story of her career and accomplishments. To everyone else in this new chapter of her life, she was just a kind elderly woman enjoying her retirement. But Martha Jefferson had learned long ago that sometimes the quietest position was the most powerful one. As she turned out the lights, she smiled, knowing that her experience and wisdom might still be needed, even in retirement. She just didn't know how soon that would prove to be true. Officers James Cooper and Michael Reynolds sat in their patrol car, parked in the shadows of an old oak tree. Cooper, a stocky man with cold eyes, checked his notepad where he kept track of their special stops. Next to him, Reynolds took a long sip of coffee, his thin face showing no emotion. "Look at this month's numbers," Cooper said, tapping his pen against the paper. "We're down from last month. Need to step it up." He wasn't talking about actual police work. These numbers represented the money they had collected from fake citations given to elderly residents in black neighborhoods. Reynolds nodded, crushing his empty coffee cup. "Old Lady Johnson almost reported us last week," he said. "But who's going to believe her over 2 officers?" Both men laughed, a but their laughter held no joy. Their scheme was simple but effective. They would follow older residents, mostly from black neighborhoods, and make up fake traffic violations. Most victims paid the fines without question, too scared or too tired to fight back. Those who did complain were dismissed by their supervisors, who barely looked at the reports. That morning, they spotted Mrs. Wilson, a 75-year-old grandmother, walking to her car. She had already paid them 3 times for made-up violations. Cooper started the engine, but Reynolds put up his hand. "Wait," Reynolds said, pointing to another car. "That one looks better." A well-dressed elderly woman was getting into a newer model sedan. What they didn't know was that it was Martha Jefferson, but to them, she was just another target. They followed her car for several blocks, staying just far enough back to not draw attention. Martha drove perfectly, following every traffic rule, but that didn't matter to Cooper and Reynolds. They had already decided to stop her. Meanwhile, at the police station, Sergeant Thompson was looking through complaint files. Several elderly residents had written letters about Cooper and Reynolds, but Thompson just added them to the growing pile of ignored complaints. He had worked with these officers for 5 years and didn't want any trouble. Back on the street, Cooper and Reynolds watched as their new target pulled into the grocery store parking lot. "Let's wait until she comes out," Cooper said. "Easier to corner them in their driveways." Reynolds agreed, taking out his ticket book. As they waited, an elderly man approached their patrol car. It was Mr. Davis, one of their previous victims. "Officers," he said nervously, "about that ticket last week. I checked my car, and there wasn't any problem with the brake lights." Cooper's face hardened. "Are you saying we lied, Mr. Davis?" His voice was quiet but threatening. Reynolds got out of the car, standing tall over the scared old man. Mr. Davis backed away quickly. No, I must be mistaken. I'll pay the fine." He hurried away, his hands shaking as he gripped his walking cane. "Too easy," Reynolds laughed, getting back in the car. Cooper smiled, but then his radio crackled. It was Sergeant Thompson. "Any units in the east side, respond to a disturbance call," Thompson's voice said. Cooper ignored it. They had more profitable things to do. Inside the grocery store, Martha was taking her time, carefully selecting fresh vegetables for her garden. She had noticed the patrol car following her but showed no sign of concern. Years of legal experience had taught her to observe quietly and gather evidence. As she checked out, Martha sent a quick text to her old friend Judge Williams. "Remember that pattern we discussed? I think I found something interesting." She didn't wait for a response before putting her phone away. Cooper and Reynolds watched as Martha loaded her groceries into her car. "Perfect," Cooper said, starting the engine. "Nice car, lives alone, probably has money. This should be a good one." They didn't know that their next target had spent 3 decades putting corrupt officials behind bars. They didn't know she had already spotted their badge numbers and taken photos of their patrol car. They didn't know that their simple scheme was about to meet its match in Martha Jefferson. As Martha drove home, the patrol car pulled up behind her. In her rearview mirror, she saw them following, just as she expected. Her face remained calm, but her mind was already working, planning her next moves like the skilled legal strategist she was. Martha Jefferson pulled into her driveway smoothly, watching in her mirror as the police car stopped behind her, blocking her in. She reached for her phone, quietly turning on the video recording feature before placing it in her cup holder, lens facing out the window. Officers Cooper and Reynolds took their time getting out of their patrol car. They walked with the confident swagger of men who thought they held all the power. Cooper approached the driver's side while Reynolds stood back, hand resting on his belt. "License and registration, ma'am," Cooper said, not bothering to introduce himself or explain why he had stopped her. His voice carried the fake politeness that Martha had heard countless times in her career. Martha kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. "Officer Cooper," she said calmly, reading his nameplate. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Her voice was steady and clear, showing no fear. Cooper's eye twitched slightly at her direct question. Most of their elderly victims were too scared to ask questions. "Your left taillight is out," he lied smoothly. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "That's interesting," Martha replied, still not moving. "I had all my lights checked just yesterday." She pressed a small button on her key fob, and all her car lights turned on, clearly working perfectly. Reynolds stepped forward now, his face hardening. "Ma'am, Officer Cooper gave you an order. Step out of the vehicle." His hand stayed on his belt, trying to look threatening. Martha smiled slightly, reaching slowly for her purse. "Before I do that, I'd like to note that you've been following me since the grocery store. That's approximately 2.3 miles of surveillance without cause." She pulled out her phone, now openly recording. "Would you like to explain that?" Cooper's confident smile faltered for a moment. "Put the phone away, ma'am. Recording officers can be considered interference with police duties. This usually scared people into compliance." But Martha didn't flinch. "Actually, Officer Cooper, according to State Law Section 183.2, citizens have the right to record law enforcement during any interaction. I'm quite familiar with that statute." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm also familiar with Section 225.4 regarding police harassment and false stops." Reynolds stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his presence. "Listen here, lady. We don't need some old woman quoting laws at us. We're the police. Now step out of the car, or we'll have to use force." Tommy and his mother, Sarah, watched nervously from their porch across the street. Other neighbors began appearing in windows and doorways, witnessing the scene unfold. Mrs. Johnson had her phone out, also recording. Martha remained perfectly composed. "Officer Reynolds, that sounded very much like a threat. Combined with your partner's false statement about my taillight, we're building quite an interesting case here." She reached for her glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately. "Hands where we can see them." Cooper barked, his hand moving to his weapon. Several neighbors gasped, but Martha remained calm. "I'm simply reaching for my credentials," Martha said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You see, before you continue with this harassment, you might want to know who I am." Cooper laughed harshly. "Lady, we don't care who you are. You're just another." He stopped mid-sentence as Martha held up her identification card. "I'm Martha Jefferson, recently retired state's attorney," she said clearly, watching their faces change. "And I've been investigating a peculiar pattern of complaints about 2 officers targeting elderly residents in predominantly black neighborhoods with fraudulent citations." The color drained from both officers' faces. Reynolds took a step back, his hand dropping from his belt. Cooper's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Now," Martha continued, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the courtroom, "would you like to explain why you followed me for 2.3 miles? Or shall we discuss this matter with Internal Affairs?" She smiled pleasantly, but her eyes were sharp and focused. The neighbors watched in amazement as the 2 previously aggressive officers suddenly looked like schoolboys caught in serious trouble. Mrs. Johnson whispered to another neighbor, "That's our Ms. Martha, the same one who helps kids with homework." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene as Martha sat calmly in her car, waiting for the officer's response. She had spent her career facing down corrupt officials, and these 2 were about to learn that retirement hadn't dulled her skills one bit. Officer Cooper's hands began to shake slightly as he stared at Martha's state attorney identification card. Behind him, Officer Reynolds took another step back, almost tripping over his own feet. The confident bullies of moments ago had vanished, replaced by 2 very worried men. We didn't know," Cooper stammered, trying to regain his composure. "We were just doing routine patrol work, ma'am." His voice had lost all its previous authority. Martha raised one eyebrow. "Routine patrol work?" She repeated calmly. "Let's review what just happened, shall we?" She held up her phone, still recording. "You followed me for 2.3 miles, claimed my taillight was broken when it clearly works, threatened me for recording our interaction, and attempted to intimidate me out of my vehicle." More neighbors had gathered now, watching from a safe distance. Tommy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is Ms. Martha in trouble?" Sarah shook her head, smiling. "No, honey. I think those officers are the ones in trouble." Reynolds tried to salvage the situation. "Miss Jefferson, there's been a misunderstanding. We can just forget this whole thing." He attempted a friendly smile that looked more like a grimace. Martha's voice took on the tone she had used countless times in court. "Officer Reynolds, in my 30 years as state's attorney, I learned that misunderstanding is what corrupt officials call their crimes when they get caught." She opened her car door slowly, standing up straight despite her age. In the past month alone, she continued, I've documented 17 complaints from elderly residents in this neighborhood. Each one describes the same pattern: two officers making false claims about violations, demanding immediate payment of fines, and threatening anyone who questions their authority. Cooper's face went pale. Those complaints were handled internally, he said weakly. By Sergeant Thompson? Martha asked, watching their reactions carefully. Yes, I know about him too. It's amazing what people will tell you when you're just the nice retired lady who helps with homework. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward from the crowd. They gave me 3 tickets last month, she said loudly. Said my registration was expired. It wasn't. Other neighbors began to speak up too, sharing similar stories. Martha nodded, taking out a small notebook. I have all their statements recorded, along with dates, badge numbers, and copies of the falsified tickets. She looked directly at the officers. Would you like to know what else I have? Reynolds looked desperately at Cooper, who was sweating despite the cool air. They both knew their careers were about to end, and prison time was a real possibility. Please? Cooper said quietly, we can work something out. His tough guy act had completely crumbled. Martha's voice was firm but not unkind. Yes, we can, but it will be done properly, through official channels. I want both of you in Captain Rivera's office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Bring Sergeant Thompson, too. She smiled. I still have lunch with the captain every month. We'll all have quite a conversation. And if we don't come? Reynolds asked, immediately regretting his words as Martha's eyes fixed on him. Then I take everything I have directly to the FBI's Public Corruption Division, she said simply. I'm sure they'd be very interested in officers targeting elderly black citizens for fraudulent fines. The media would certainly find it newsworthy too. Cooper grabbed Reynolds' arm. We'll be there, he said quickly. All of us. They hurried back to their patrol car, nearly falling over each other in their rush to leave. As the police car drove away, the neighbors burst into applause. Martha turned to them with a gentle smile, once again the kind elderly lady they knew. Now then, she said, who needs help with homework? That evening, Martha sat in her home office, organizing her evidence files. Her phone buzzed with a message from Judge Williams. Just heard about your run-in with Cooper and Reynolds. Still fighting the good fight, I see. Need any help? Martha smiled as she replied. Have all the evidence ready, but keep Thursday open. We might need a warrant. She looked at the photo of her late husband on her desk. The game's not over yet, she whispered. It's just moved to a different court. At exactly 9 o'clock a.m. the next morning, Martha Jefferson sat in Captain Rivera's office, her evidence files neatly arranged on the desk. The captain, a stern-faced woman with 25 years of service, read through the documents with growing anger. Officers Cooper and Reynolds sat nervously in chairs against the wall, while Sergeant Thompson stood uncomfortably by the door. None of them would meet Martha's steady gaze. 32 cases, Captain Rivera said, closing the last file. 32 elderly citizens targeted in just 3 months. Her voice was quiet but filled with controlled fury. And you, Thompson, buried every single complaint. Thompson shifted his weight, looking at his shoes. I didn't think the complaints were serious, he mumbled. Cooper and Reynolds remained silent, knowing their careers were finished. Martha opened her laptop. Captain, there's more, she said calmly. I spent last night accessing the police database. My old passwords still work. She turned the screen to show a spreadsheet. Look at the pattern of fine collections in these neighborhoods. The numbers told a clear story. Every month, hundreds of dollars in fines collected from elderly residents, mostly in black neighborhoods. The money was logged, but the violations were vague and poorly documented. How long has this been going on? Captain Rivera demanded, turning to Thompson. 2 years, Martha answered before Thompson could speak. I found similar patterns in other precincts too. It's not just these 3. She pulled out more files. 5 other officers across the city are using the same scheme. Cooper suddenly found his voice. You can't prove all that. It's just numbers on a page. His face went red as Martha smiled. Actually, Martha said, reaching into her bag, I can prove everything. She placed a small recorder on the desk. Remember Mrs. Johnson? She's been wearing a wire for the past week, so have 6 other residents. The recording played clearly. Cooper's voice demanding money for a non-existent violation, threatening an elderly woman with arrest if she didn't pay immediately. Reynolds could be heard laughing in the background. Thompson collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. "We're done," he whispered. "We're all done." Captain Rivera picked up her phone. Internal Affairs needs to see this now. She paused, looking at Martha. "You've built a solid case, just like the old days." Martha nodded but held up her hand. "Before you make that call, there's something else." She opened another file. "These officers targeted vulnerable people, yes. But who taught them this scheme? Who profits the most?" She spread out bank records, showing suspicious deposits into an account belonging to Lieutenant Parker, the precinct's second in command. The amounts matched the totals from the fraudulent fines, minus what the officers kept for themselves. "My God," Captain Rivera whispered. "Parker's been running this whole operation." Martha stood up slowly, her voice firm. "This goes beyond a few corrupt officers, Maria," she said, using the captain's first name. "This is systematic targeting of elderly black citizens, organized from above. We need to go bigger than internal affairs." She pulled out her phone, showing a text message. "The FBI is already interested. Agent Wilson is waiting for my call. This could expose corruption across multiple precincts." Cooper and Reynolds looked at each other in panic. Thompson had his head in his hands. Their small scheme had just become part of a major federal investigation. "You'd have a choice," Martha told them. "Cooperate fully, tell the FBI everything about Parker and anyone else involved, or face the maximum charges." She smiled slightly. "I may be retired, but I still know how to make a deal." Captain Rivera stood up, her decision made. "I'm calling the FBI now. Nobody leaves this room." She looked at Martha with respect. "You never could stay retired, could you?" Martha gathered her files calmly. "When there's injustice, there's work to be done," she said simply. She looked at the three corrupt officers, seeing not monsters but sad, broken men who had betrayed their badges. Sometimes the best service to the community is exposing those who abuse their power. Outside the office, the morning sun shone through the windows. Martha's quiet retirement had turned into something much bigger, but she was ready. She had spent her life fighting corruption, and this fight was far from over. The community center was packed. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls. Martha Jefferson sat at a table in front, watching as more neighbors squeezed into the room. What had started as a small meeting had turned into something much bigger. Mrs. Johnson stood at the microphone, her voice shaking but determined. "They took $300 from me," she said. "Said my registration was expired when it wasn't. I couldn't pay my electric bill that month because of their fake ticket." Similar stories filled the room. One by one, elderly residents came forward to share their experiences. Some had lost their savings to fake fines. Others had gone hungry to pay tickets they didn't deserve. Each story made the crowd's anger grow stronger. Martha watched carefully, taking notes. Next to her sat FBI agent Wilson, recording every testimony. The agent's presence showed how serious the investigation had become. This wasn't just about Cooper and Reynolds anymore. It was about years of systematic abuse. Tommy's mother, Sarah, stood up next. "My grandmother lives across town," she said. "The same thing happened to her. Different officers, same scheme. They targeted her because she's elderly and black. They thought nobody would listen to her." Agent Wilson leaned over to Martha. "We've identified 12 officers involved so far," she whispered. "And Lieutenant Parker's bank records show this goes back at least 5 years." Martha nodded, then raised her hand for quiet. The room fell silent as she stood up. "What these officers did was wrong," she said clearly, "but they counted on our silence. They thought we wouldn't fight back. Today, we proved them wrong." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are legal forms to reclaim your money. Agent Wilson will help each of you file official complaints. Every fake ticket, every false charge, we'll get it all back." The crowd murmured with hope. An elderly man in the back called out, "But who will believe us over the police?" Martha smiled. "They'll believe evidence. Mrs. Johnson and others helped us record the officers' threats. We have bank records showing where the money went. And now, we have your testimonies." Young Tommy, sitting with his mother, raised his hand. "Ms. Martha, is this why you teach us to always tell the truth? because the truth is stronger than lies. The room grew quiet, waiting for her answer. Martha looked at the boy thoughtfully. Yes, Tommy, the truth may take time to come out, but it cannot stay hidden forever. These officers forgot that. They thought their badges would protect their lies. More people began arriving, some from other neighborhoods. They had heard about the meeting and came to share similar stories. Martha and Agent Wilson stayed for hours, helping each person file their complaint properly. As the sun set, Martha stood at the window, watching people leave the community center. They walked differently now, heads held higher, shoulders straighter. Fear was being replaced by determination. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Rivera. Parker tried to run. FBI caught him at the airport. He's ready to talk. Martha showed the message to Agent Wilson. This is bigger than we thought, the agent said. Parker's talking about corruption in 3 other precincts. We might need a bigger room for next week's meeting. Martha watched as Mrs. Johnson helped an elderly man fill out his complaint form. Children played nearby while their parents shared stories and supported each other. The community wasn't just filing complaints, they were finding their collective voice. You know, Martha said to Agent Wilson, when I moved here, I thought I was retiring. I just wanted to help kids with homework and grow tomatoes. She smiled, watching her neighbors helping each other. But sometimes justice finds you, even when you're not looking for it. Outside, the street lights came on, but nobody was leaving yet. There were more stories to share, more forms to fill out, more truth to be told. The quiet neighborhood had found its strength, and Martha Jefferson had found a new way to fight for justice, not in a courtroom this time, but in a community center filled with brave people ready to stand up for their rights. The courthouse was unusually busy that morning. People filled every bench in the hallway, many of them elderly residents from Martha's neighborhood. They had come to witness justice being served. Inside the courtroom, Martha sat in the front row, her face calm but alert. Next to her, Mrs. Johnson held her hand tightly as they watched officers Cooper and Reynolds being led in by bailiffs. The once proud officers now wore handcuffs and prison orange jumpsuits. Sergeant Thompson had already made his plea deal last week, agreeing to testify against Lieutenant Parker and the other corrupt officers. His testimony had opened a flood of evidence that couldn't be ignored or buried anymore. Judge Williams, Martha's old friend, looked down from the bench at the defendants. Before we proceed, she said firmly, I want to note that this courtroom has never seen a case quite like this one. The systematic targeting of elderly black citizens by those sworn to protect them is a betrayal of the highest order. Cooper and Reynolds stood with their heads down as the charges were read. Extortion, abuse of power, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Behind them, Lieutenant Parker sat with his own lawyers, knowing his turn would come next. The evidence was overwhelming. Martha's careful documentation, the recorded conversations, bank records, and testimony from over 50 victims painted a clear picture of corruption. The FBI investigation had uncovered similar schemes in 3 other precincts. The defendants have agreed to plead guilty, the prosecutor announced. Martha noticed how young the prosecutor looked and remembered her own early days in court. As part of their plea agreement, they will provide full testimony about all officers involved in this corruption scheme. Mrs. Johnson squeezed Martha's hand as Cooper and Reynolds said guilty in quiet voices. Other corrupt officers would face justice in the coming weeks, but these 2, the ones who had threatened their neighborhood, were the first to fall. Judge Williams spoke again. Before I announce the sentences, would any of the victims like to speak? Several hands went up, including Mrs. Johnson's. One by one, they told their stories. They spoke of missed meals to pay fake fines, of fear when police cars appeared on their street, of the shame they felt being harassed in front of their grandchildren. Each story added to the weight of justice about to fall. Martha didn't need to speak. Her work had given these people their voice back, and now they used it with power and dignity. She watched as Cooper and Reynolds seemed to shrink with each testimony, finally understanding the real human cost of their crimes. The sentences came down hard. 5 years in federal prison for each officer, plus they had to repay every dollar they had stolen. Lieutenant Parker, watching from the back, went pale as he realized what his own sentence might be. Outside the courthouse after the hearing, reporters gathered around Martha. Miss Jefferson, one called out, "Did you plan this when you moved to the neighborhood?" Martha smiled, looking at her neighbors who had become her friends. Sometimes justice finds you when you're just trying to grow tomatoes, she said. The crowd laughed, but they understood the serious truth behind her words. Captain Rivera approached Martha as the reporters left. The department is changing because of you, she said. We're implementing new oversight measures, body camera reviews, and community feedback systems, but we need help making sure it works. Martha raised an eyebrow. What kind of help? We're forming a citizen oversight committee, Rivera explained. People who will review police conduct and make sure nothing like this happens again. We'd like you to lead it. Before Martha could answer, young Tommy pushed through the crowd. Ms. Martha, did the bad officers go to jail? His mother Sarah followed, smiling apologetically. Martha looked at the boy, then at Captain Rivera. Yes, Tommy, they did. Justice worked today. She turned back to the captain. And yes, I'll help with the committee. But first, I have some homework to check. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Martha, her neighbors, and the honest police officers who had helped expose the truth, the afternoon sun made their shadows long and strong. Justice had been served, but Martha knew this was just the beginning of real change. 6 months had passed since the courthouse day. Martha's garden was in full bloom, with tomatoes ripening on sturdy vines. But her porch had become more than just a place for plants. It was now the heart of community change. Every Tuesday and Thursday, police officers in training sat on her porch, learning from elderly residents about their experiences. It was part of the new community relations program that Martha had helped design. Today, Officer Sarah Chen, a rookie, listened carefully as Mrs. Johnson shared her story. We were afraid to even leave our homes some days, Mrs. Johnson explained to the young officer. But now, things are different. She smiled at Martha, who was watering her tomatoes nearby. The changes went far beyond their neighborhood. Lieutenant Parker's trial had exposed corruption in police departments across 3 states. Martha's case had become a model for other communities fighting similar problems. Her phone rang daily with calls from community leaders seeking advice. Inside her home office, a new sign hung next to her law degree. Citizens Police Oversight Committee. Chair, Martha Jefferson. More important to her was the wall of photos showing community events. Picnics where officers and residents shared meals, youth programs where police taught kids basketball, and weekly meetings where people could voice their concerns without fear. Young Tommy, now earning A's in math thanks to Martha's continued tutoring, burst onto the porch. Ms. Martha, did you see the news? They're using your program in Chicago now. Martha nodded, putting down her watering can. The Jefferson Protocol, as they called it, was spreading. It required regular meetings between police and elderly residents, body camera reviews by citizen committees, and special training for officers working in minority communities. Captain Rivera, now promoted to deputy chief, walked up the garden path. She carried a thick folder and wore a proud smile. The numbers are in, she announced to everyone on the porch. Complaints against officers down 80%. Community trust levels up 70%, and 0 incidents of fraudulent citations in 6 months. The rookie officer, Chen, looked amazed. All this because one person stood up to corrupt officers? No, Martha said firmly, sitting down in her favorite porch chair. All this because an entire community found its voice. I just helped them use it. She looked at the group of elderly residents who had become her close friends. Every person who spoke up, who shared their story, who refused to be silenced, they're the real heroes. Mrs. Johnson laughed softly. Says the woman who took down an entire corruption ring while pretending to be just a retired gardener. Martha's phone buzzed, another message from the FBI. More arrests had been made in a neighboring state, thanks to evidence that had started with her case. The ripples of change kept spreading. Tommy's mother Sarah, who now led the community youth program, joined them on the porch. My son asked me something interesting today, she said. He wanted to know if he could become both a police officer and a lawyer, like Ms. Martha. He says he wants to protect people from both sides of the law. The group smiled, even Officer Chen. The future was changing, one young mind at a time. As the sun began to set, Martha looked at her flourishing garden and the even more flourishing community. Cooper and Reynolds were serving their time, Harker was facing 20 years, and honest officers like Chen were learning to serve with integrity and compassion. You know, Martha said, pouring lemonade for everyone. When I retired, I thought my days of fighting for justice were over. I was wrong. She handed out the glasses. Justice isn't just found in courtrooms. It grows in communities, like these tomatoes, with care, attention, and people working together. Officer Chen raised her glass. To Ms. Martha, who taught us that sometimes the most powerful person in the neighborhood is the kind lady helping kids with homework. As they all laughed and drank their lemonade, Martha smiled contentedly. Her garden had grown more than vegetables. It had grown hope, trust, and change. The corrupt officers who had targeted her that day had unknowingly sparked a transformation that would help communities for years to come. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow there would be more homework to check, more officers to train, and more justice to nurture. Just another day in Martha Jefferson's not-so-quiet retirement.